The Civil War marked a great turning point in America's history. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the country was transformed from a rural republic to an urban state. Frontiers vanished in the face of westward expansion. Factories and steel mills appeared on the scene, fueled by immigrant labor streaming through Ellis Island.
What is fueling the growth of steel mills and factories?
Great transcontinental railroad lines linked the country together like never before. But with these advances came the evils of poverty and overcrowding. Poor working conditions and labor unrest marred the workplace, and the growing output of factories for the first time threatened the environment. It was in this setting that America came of age, poised on the brink of a revolution. The American Industrial Revolution.
What revolution is America facing?
In 1870, America was a geographically isolated country. During the last 3 decades of the 19th century, Americans occupied a much larger portion of the country's land than during the 3 previous centuries. The saturation of railways was key to this important geographic change. The economic consequence of the railroads was immeasurable. When engine power moved from wood to coal, the demand for coal tripled. When rails moved beyond iron to steel, the modern steel industry evolved. Many other industries emerged as well. Notably, the refrigerated freight car, developed in partnership with Gustav Swift, gave birth to the meatpacking industry.
The refrigerated train car gave birth to what industry?
And the grain, lumber, and steel industries virtually exploded as new railways transported huge resources to towns, cities, and ports across the country. The growth of the railroad was astounding. In 1870, there were 57,000 miles of railroad track in the continental U.S. By 1890, this figure had grown to nearly 167,000 miles. Innovations in the railroad network, such as the air brake and sleeping cars, made rail travel smoother, safer, and more comfortable. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. Patent Office issued less than 1,000 patents annually. By 1890, inventions were being registered at the rate of 25,000 each year. The invention of the typewriter, the adding machine, and the cash register sped the growth of business. George Eastman's Brownie camera, the elevator, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone all mark this new season of ingenuity. By 1900, Bell's phone had found its way into 1 million homes.
How many homes had telephones by 1900?
Despite advances in industry, agriculture remained America's basic occupation. Like the revolution in industry, the switch from hand labor to mechanized labor marked the revolution in agriculture. By 1870, the reaper, thresher, steel plow, and combine had encouraged farming in the rugged prairies west of the Mississippi. To feed the growing population, settlers pushed west to cultivate new lands, due in part to the Homestead Act of 1862. Between 1860 and 1890, the nation's population more than doubled, but the American farmer rose to the challenge, growing enough grain, cotton, and corn, and raising enough beef and pork to not only supply the growing population, but to create a surplus as well. By 1890, the first successful gasoline-powered tractors were in use, enabling farmers to meet urban demand. Each successful farm produced enough food to feed 5 people in 1850. 40 years later, those same farms could feed 15 people, largely through the use of more sophisticated and modern equipment. Along with these conveniences came problems unique to modern development. By 1890, overproduction had begun to occur, leading to a glut of produce on the world market. Inevitably, prices plummeted. With increasing demand, shipping rates were steadily rising, and by 1877, it took fully half of gross sales to pay the exorbitant freight charges. Overwhelmed by this predicament, 80% of homestead farms failed by 1900. Most never completed their 5-year residency requirement.
What was one cause for the failure of most homestead farms?
The American Industrial Revolution was marked not only by the changing face of American industry, but also by the changing face of America. As mills and factories sprouted across the land, cities grew up around them. In turn, the cities beckoned to workers by the millions from the American countryside and from overseas to fuel the burgeoning industrialization. What was once a rural nation was rapidly becoming an urban state. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population grew from 6 million to over 44 million.
What was the total urban population by 1910? The number of people living in cities.
Rural Americans abandoned their farms to take factory jobs in the big cities. Joining them en masse were new immigrants from overseas. By 1870, they were arriving on American shores at a rate of nearly 400,000 per year. By 1882, this number had doubled to 800,000 annually. Before the mid-19th century, America had a seemingly endless supply of natural resources, including timber, minerals, and wildlife. Throughout much of the country's history, pollution was not a major problem, but the Industrial Revolution upset the balance between man and nature. For decades, waste from factories was dumped haphazardly into lakes, rivers, and streams. Pollution from the mainstream use of factory machinery and motor-driven vehicles had an adverse impact on the atmosphere.
What new problem is facing the United States due to chemicals and waste from industrialization?
By 1870, the devastating consequence to natural and animal resources spurred the formation of wildlife organizations dedicated to reversing this dangerous trend. Wide-scale, careless environmental pollution became an issue vigorously debated in political circles. By 1880, modern conservationists who had become organized to champion the movement lobbied congressmen and state legislators. In response, by 1890, Congress had set aside millions of acres of land across the U.S. to preserve resources. Huge expanses of terrain were set aside as national parks and habitats. Water pollution was addressed in 1899 when the Rivers and Harbors Act prohibited the dumping of waste in the nation's harbors, canals, and waterways.